So let's attempt to make a Heideggerian sortie into the question on how one is to understand the political leader as subject to the demand to eudaimonia. So in Olympiodorus, at the end of the Platonic school, when it was closed down in order to become by Justinian, in order to become a school for training the jurists, the Latin jurists teaching the natural law. Olympiodorus came out with a statement concerning Plato's youthful trip to Sicily to meet with the tyrant Diogenes, and soliciting to be flattered, Diogenes asked the youthful nobleman, Platon, aren't I eudaimonia? And Platon, unfazed, said, no, but Socrates is. So let's try to connect it up. So the way I'll try to access this whole thing through Heidegger is, so when we're talking about a question which would seem to pose a bunch of fundamental questions about what a human being is. But so let's try to approach it from the sort of, see, Heidegger was raised Catholic, but in Catholic Freiburg, but then he went to Marburg, and there's a Lutheran city, and he studied Luther quite a bit. So you have this split in his thinking to some extent, but let's start. I mean, Luther was important for Heidegger, but also a Catholic was very important for Heidegger. But a Catholic has been accused of being questionable in his own time, Meister Eckhart. So we could say Meister Eckhart, however, was part of the most sort of respectable of the Christians of his day in his origins, because he went to the University of Paris and he studied and became a Dominican when Aquinas was new, when Aquinas was displacing Averroes and bringing the Catholic teaching into its sort of Silver Age or whatever, back into the prelapsarian incipiency or Ursprungness, where it's uncorrupted, where it's the spirit seems to have one of its primary bubblings up, a pure mountain spring in Aquinas, and especially Aquinas' Aristotelianism, which continues to play such a large role through Kant and Hegel and so on, more in Hegel than in Kant. So let me think of an antidote for a second to get to let's get to Eckhart's teaching then. There's an anecdote, it's true, I think, that this Holocaust denier, Christian Littner, who did sort of lengthy pugilism with the guy, I think his name is Harold Butts, the really adamantite Holocaust denier historian in England, and at length Christian Littner convinced himself that this notion that some of these arguments just simply couldn't hold in Butts, and basically then the House of Cards collapsed, and especially that the Butts had made this argument that we have to make Auschwitz our battleship that's unsinkable or something like that, and these arguments around that the French guy that Chomsky had said ought to be able to go around America speaking, and because of free speech, but de facto, I remember that he was denied speech at the I House, according to some people that were there that reported what was happening. But there was a bunch of confusion about when they were the International House up here at the top of Bancroft and above the UC Berkeley campus, or I guess in a way part of the UC Berkeley campus. But Lintner, aside from this, this whole thing kind of proved to me Lintner's intellectual credibility, that he went through all this, that he kind of struggled with it, and finally, after being a Holocaust denier, came to the view that that view couldn't really be upheld, but then came over to the view, which I think was also what the former president Ahmadinejad of Iran actually held in his so-called Holocaust denying conference, which is that it's not so much that he's denying that there were death camps, but what he's denying is that the concept of Holocaust is legitimate, in contradistinction to some other version of what happened, such as maybe a version that would highlight the greater number of deaths of Soviets, for instance, and presented in a different light, rather than rather than in the light that there can be no poetry after the Holocaust, and other similar statements that seem to have a cognitive dignity in some circles. Seem to be somehow Calon or beautiful in some sense, and this sort of proximity to Paul Celan and all these people. But in any case, Lintner also was a theorist of a theory that one could show from Sanskrit sources that all kinds of anecdotes and sufficient to collapse the argument in amongst the theologians who think that the primary gospels, the synoptic gospels, are accurate, enough to convince us, in his view, enough to convince any honest scholar of that this is not, these narratives have their origin already in this Hindu text. And so he confronted the head of the anecdote is that he confronted the head of the Church of Denmark with this. I think it actually happened, and there's even a videotape of it. And then the head of the Church of Denmark cited Kierkegaard at him and said, even if Christ were here before you, it wouldn't help at all in being a believer. So I think the argument behind this is basically the John 16:7 argument that Christ is saying in the translation, it's expedient that I should go, such that the true comforter will come upon you. And then sort of the explication of that is that Christ himself is sort of the outward sign, and that the true comforter is the direct Geist, or the direct knowing of the God from the light that lights from within, so that then Eckhart Tolle can say, and I think the mystic that Robert De Niro quoted in Cape Fear, his character quoted in Cape Fear when he shouted out, I am as large as you are as small as I am. It's from this period of Christian thinking that if this light of the Spirit is shining from within us directly, then God is right there in our midst. And so I think we could link that up to Heidegger we could superimpose it, but then don't have, the reason people like Heidegger is because he always gives very nicely the extremely subtle details that really show you the thinking. And then we get into, so the the degree to which I can get at it is this. I can see that there's a problem in Meister Eckhart's version, which then becomes highlighted in the constant questioning of the inner and outer man, which is this, and Dugin still applies this to Dasein and to Heidegger, and I think Heidegger does in a way. He's still, probably Dugin's correct in that, but I don't think it's the same as, it can't be taken straightforwardly the same as the way Eckhart Tolle does it in terms of, Eckhart Tolle, Meister Eckhart. But I think, but Eckhart Tolle, we could superimpose that as a very vague version, that one that comes directly sort of from the source of a living God, but a living God with not that much special, a God in the direct sense, not in the sense of one who has access to the rational teaching. I don't think there's anything. I think Eckhart Tolle is interesting just because of his. He's not in a human state of consciousness. He's in the God state of consciousness, but in a very particular way. But anyway, let's not sideline too long on that. Whereas Christ also, but whereas Christ is, just as you could have Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, it's kind of similar level of strength of personalities. Their age is a little different. Their life experience is different, but they have different qualities. And then obviously, Trump is probably stronger, and Bannon is a little bit, I think, more mentally agile. But in the same way, amongst the gods, you have different personalities, right? So, but then one could ask in a different way, what gives them the insight into the right direct teaching? So is it through an experience, or is it through some direct connection to the spirit? But this seems to be the wealth that Meister Eckhart wants to distinguish himself from Aquinas and from the Aristotelian teaching by saying it's more direct. And well, let me give this here's a more exact detail I can give. The problem after Descartes comes in, so maybe it's not totally clear. I think it is clear. Yeah, it's clear in Meister Eckhart, because the way Meister Eckhart says is there are some people that do anthropomorphism, and the way he understands that is that you see somebody, say, wincing or something, and then you infer, because you're anthropos, or human being, you infer the same inner experience on them. But it happens through a mental act we call inference. You think, oh yeah, they must feel like I felt then. So that's kind of like a Cartesian subject analysis. You'd have to halt here and kind of look at it more closely to see what's the difference between the Cartesian claim that there's some things that can be presented as a mechanical external process involving extension, and then there's other things that can't, and these two regions can be neatly distinguished. That's one way to see the Heidegger rejects that as a horizon of beginning. So these questions in Meister Eckhart lead us to a certain view of something like phenomenology, or a claim to be more direct, and then we could explicate that further by saying Heidegger. So I'm just trying to give some avenues into the way Heidegger thought about it, which then we could ask whether that's the way we see it by comparing it, and we can make other operations from there. But it places us somewhere. It sort of throws us somewhere. It gives us the Geworfenheit. It gives us a certain intelligibility by which we could then say, perhaps we could ask, is this the right intelligibility? So we have the notion of Dionysius who says the rose blossoms because it blossoms, it has no why. Now, Heidegger says this is a direct form of phenomenology, this no why. The rose is just blossoming, things are just thinging or whatever, and there's the no why version. That's sort of maybe the supposed existentialist version in a way. It could be contrasted with the concept of nature. Nature says there is a why, and the why is nature, and nature is why things come forward the way they do. So there's kind of a direct contrast. You could say then that it depends quite a bit on how we understand nature, and that's when Nietzsche attacks the old Stoics and says the Stoics, they just conform to nature, and then you'll be in how does Egger put it, the Gelassenheit, right? He'll be in the calm, which isn't due to being numbed or to ignorance of any kind, but just which is due to having the right immediate light on things, as that light from John 16:7 suggests. If everything's lit in the right way and God is the one doing the lighting, as though not something extra added on, but immediately, then the I am is active, right? This way of addressing it, then we could say, is this already a presupposition? Is there, as it were, ground prior to this presupposition? So the problem we get in Husserl's phenomenology is, Husserl says, my phenomenology starts with the cart, with the omnibus dubitandum, only I don't never answer the question, I just let it constantly be incipient, constantly be coming forward. We have from within there the possibility of saying what Heidegger is saying is, the reason I can't name the Ereignisse or name being is because every time I do that, it presents itself as a why, and then there's the Nietzschean addition that this too is a kind of why. So in other words, if I point to the Angelius Celsius and say the rose has no why, this too is a kind of why. So how does it look? Try to be more Heideggerian. What people like about Heidegger is sort of that he gives the most precise details we can. So what does the why mean? I think we could say, besides from the atia or the so-called four causes in Aristotle, speaking more generally, the why means clarifying to ourselves what we're talking about, or giving an explanation. So there's, in the case of the Angelius Celsius, the rose has no why. It blossoms because it blossoms. In other words, that it's not up to us to explain the process of why this is coming forth by saying there's something called nature, and then to investigate it under the notion of nature, and then to keep saying what nature means. So for instance, and then when Nietzsche, so let's double back a little bit to that I didn't really fill out, is when Nietzsche is saying, look at these fools, the Stoics, they say simply conform to nature, but why aren't they doing that already? They're coming forward as they come. They're coming forth as they come forth. In other words, they are as they are. But they want something in addition. So this is unfair. This is unfair criticism, so far as we say look at details, and then we say, what did the Stoics actually mean by nature? They meant things like Cicero says a man will act like, or he quotes some interlocutor to say, a man in old age will sometimes act like the weight of Mount Etna is on him. But who told him that he had to accept this? Who told him that he could? Who told him that he could expect anything other than this? That he could expect? He knew old age was coming. He knew that's the way nature comes forth. Why is he contesting what must be? Why is he contesting the necessary? That's the source of his unhappiness. He must get into this ataraxia, if that's the right way to say it. Get into this undisturbed tranquility, which is a little bit like the reception of the Holy Spirit in that John 16:7. But it's strange, isn't it, that Christ, and that they translate as, it's expedient that I should go. So this means there's an action happening. Christ actually has to leave physically, as it were, the Christ, which is serving as the image for them. The actual embodied Christ is in a way an image which prevents them from having the light of the Spirit. There's a contrast between the actual testimony of history and Christ coming, which is considered as lesser, as still testified by the head of the Church of Denmark, and this direct light of God, of the Spirit of the I Am. So we have this problem in Heidegger that it seems like every such attempt to light up with a different explanation is again attacked by Nietzsche. So remember the famous Heidegger, Nietzsche had mich kaputt gemacht. Nietzsche has made me kaput or broken me. Said to, I think, one of his sons, and it wasn't clear exactly what he was talking about exactly, but it was known that Heidegger had become depressed and that his wife had duly cautioned him as soliciting for his health to stay away from that bad man Friedrich Nietzsche. So Heidegger had become would despair sometime. Then I wonder, is that because of all Nietzsche's close analysis of all this type of problem, whereby a paradigm shift happens, whereby somebody says, here's this one horizon or horizon by which we're going to explain, clarify, or give the why of a matter, and to another, and then Heidegger keeps trying to maintain there's a position prior to this, which given in Husserl's terms would be like the Natureinstellung, or the theoretical, the natural attitude or the theoretical attitude, which is the common way of describing the way the Greeks understood the move from the polis to the philosophers, or the cave to the philosophic episteme or science. Every time you have one of these presentations, then, so in Husserl, it's kind of like he presupposes the natural attitude as something without really asking about the mystical attitude. So we just went through that comparison. But in Nietzsche and Heidegger, this has all been considered, and then it's kind of like this war of who's had more considerations and what's actually plausible or serious, what a serious person could actually regard as eudaimonia and make their heimat as their direct being. And then there's all kinds of details about what that means could come out. But okay, let's look at it from the point of view. So taking all that, let's put a nice, tie a string on that and pack it up. And we don't have to look at the details so much now, but just kind of remember that and superimpose it over the Trump situation. So I've been thinking about this. There was an article in Welt, in this German Welt, W-E-L-T, World, Meaning, there's this article that said Trump has said that anything that comes out against him is illegal. Any media that is denouncing him is illegal. I don't know. That sounds like it's a little bit probably taking out of context something he said, but broadly speaking, he kind of does say that, right? It's always questionable with these things. I know, I think Ted Cruz has started coming out against Trump on the point of view of the question of the switching around of the deplatforming issue. I think one could, if you're like, especially if you were like Alan Dershowitz or something, but if you wanted to give a sort of complicated defense of Trump be his advocate. Trump doesn't really care about this type of question, but if you wanted to be his advocate and say, has Trump been inconsistent on the question of free speech? Because before he was saying, oh, they're deplatforming all our guys, and now they're saying we've got to deplatform all the enemies, all the people that are 99% of the time, according to him, saying bad things about Trump, the Jimmy Kimmel thing, and so on. The Jimmy Kimmel thing, I think maybe you could say simply he was misunderstood in a way in what he said, but I guess on the whole Kimmel is anti-Trump, so it makes sense anyway. But I would say you could make the following argument. You could say free speech means speech which is eudaimonia in the sense that Socrates proposed, which is to say there's the spirit which all the time, whenever within the bounds of prudence, will always, when they have the opportunity, try to bring about the things that are better for the country. And so then if you would simply say, so you could do it in all kinds of different ways, but just to give the simple thrust, if you were to say Trump is good for the country, forget about the vote, that's absolutely irrelevant. But is Trump good for the country? And from the Socratic view, the vote is meaningless. All we're asking is this guy good for the country? If he's good for the country, then it's not that hard to start making arguments in the direction, they at least become more cogent, in the direction of anything that speaks against the one who's good for the country, defaming them, worsening their reputation in the world, making them less effective, reducing compliance to his will, which is an expression of the thing that's good for the country, etc., etc. It'd be easy to say there's absolutely there's no contradiction in at one time suppressing Democrats or Californians. Let's say I'm a Californian myself. But say you have to suppress all Californians because Californians are always the blue state and they hate Trump. In a way, I dislike Trump too. I hate Trump in a certain way. Not as a human. I hate him because he's, in the same way he said himself, intelligent people don't like me. Maybe I won't go so far as to say hate, but I don't like him because he's not intelligent. But then again, maybe I'm wrong. So we could analyze it, right? I think in a certain sense, people are always talking about who has their skin in the game or whatever. But I think in a certain sense, Socrates, even if he's in battle and he's fighting and combat and death are in play, he's still ready to act philosophically. He's not necessarily, it doesn't matter. It's in his whole being, he's always ready to face up to this pugilism with the problems. He's always somehow open. He's not. He never succumbs to the forces of sheer stupidity, as Nietzsche sort of puts it when he gives his example of the of the yes saying ass, which just always agrees with the idea. But okay, let's sort of segue into the Trump thing. We've gone on a long way here. So first of all, does Trump display will to power, or does he display will to will? So I'm arguing villain, villa zoom villain. Will to will means the will gives itself to the project of willing in itself. Maybe that doesn't go for Trump, because Trump isn't philosophically minded, he's not theoretically minded. But it goes for him in a secondary sense. I think it could be distinguished in that whatever sort of comes before him, he kind of looks at a bunch of stuff. And then it struck me just recently when he made these remarks about going back to Afghanistan. It's like things come before him, that no other country calls their Department of Defense, Department of War anymore, and then to suddenly switch that. Things come before him, and then he just wills them. They're there, it's random. This is what Nietzsche perceived. They're there, it's random, he wills this information or this project or this agenda or whatever it is to come into being. So he's just doing will to will rather than, so in contradistinction. So that's the big in contradistinction to will Zermacht, or will that gives itself over to power. So will that gives its will to the projects of power. Rather, this is will that gives its will to the projects of will as will. The will as will has a more random flavor to it. The will as power, of course, obviously takes us into the question of power and all the external trappings that would indicate. It could also be understood differently in the sense that one can, from the higher spiritual point of view, one can say somebody becomes aware of and Nietzsche himself becomes aware of the possibility of continuously willing that the concept or the horizont or the I am or the light of that says there's something called willing be engaged, be constantly engaged, be part of the instruments of the people, be part of the sacred fire of the people. And then there could be a will to the power of this idea, for instance. There could be the will to the explicit will to the power of an idea, such that always happens, right? In Christianity, sometimes you wonder, is the preacher just trying to will that this idea, some idea, become powerful? Which doesn't mean that he's self-interested. He may sacrifice himself to the idea, but nonetheless it seems that there's something wrong with that. Simply the will that the idea become more powerful. It's almost like, I guess, in what we just said, and simply that Christ should say it's expedient that I should go, and then some people should say, oh, well, he said it's expedient, so they're put all their efforts and all their will into helping Christ leave, so that the comfort of the Spirit can come in and replace him. It seems to be an action which has a part in the so-called external world rather than in the direct seeing of the light, but these two being difficult to distinguish when pushed and at length, and when we really face up to the problem. And then that's part of what Heidegger is getting at in his statement. So again, we apply this sort of constant looking, which however isn't you see, if I say that's a kind of skepticism. This again, somebody who would keep insisting on that. It's like the OOO people who keep insisting, Heidegger's a correlationist. Well, that's the way you understand him, and you keep insisting that, but Heidegger doesn't understand himself that way, so one could as well say you simply lack the piercing power to get what Heidegger's saying, and you impose something on him. So the idea that Heidegger's and just to show that I don't do the reverse is, the idea that Heidegger's correlationist means it's assumption that there's a world and then there's intelligibility, and that therefore there's always a correlation between the world or nature and specific forms of intelligibility, as though Heidegger were, in Zizek's word, a super transcendentalist. So that's all false. That's not the way Heidegger understands himself, and it's just in Zizek's sense, it's just a mistake. In the OOO people's sense, in the worst case, there's Graham Harman, which I don't even know if he calls Heidegger a correlationist, but he's just a fake and terrible, so it's not even worth thinking about what maybe somebody might be interested in him from a general point of view of being, knowing things about philosophy in general, but as an interpreter of Heidegger, he's just a fake, so it's not worth talking about in a stupid tool book, or whatever it's called. It's not worth discussing, except possibly I could see new students looking at it from the point of view of asking the question, why is this wrong? But it's, once you get into that, it's kind of like, a lot of times these things are so wrong that it's not even worth trying to say why they're wrong. It's more worth your time just looking at Heidegger himself. But okay, if we apply this sort of attitude towards Trump, and we look directly at his increasing sort of, from the transcendentalist point of view, I put this notion that he's kind of like the famous cinnabar of Kant. So, if the transcendentalist point of view is asking the question, is the world in black and white, all else unchanged, better than the world in color, or more real than the world in color, or more true than the world in color, or more abiding and more dependable or something than the world of color. This is the kind of transcendentalist question. It's like there's something that counts as a access, and then there's the question of which form of access is privileged, if any. So we could present all that as philosophy of correlationism, and then say, what's Heidegger's attitude towards this? Well, it's one horizon, it's one horizon that comes out of the, it's one thing that could be set up as a Geworfen, and then we could try to live it, and then we could try to jump back and forth between the Geworfen and an inspection of it. And again, Heidegger would say, whenever you're doing this analysis from Dasein and Geworfenheit, he's perfectly well aware that he's again falling into the clutches of Nietzsche and presenting something which you could critique and say, well, this is just one more horizon, just one more presentation in the light of, Claude Levi-Strauss with the example of that so what solitude really means is being placed into the place in such a way that there's no distinction. And then some people, when drawing the place they're in a village, draw themselves at the center, and some don't. I see that my space is very low on my phone, so I have to stop, I think. But I had wanted to bring in Schmitt and ask the question of Trump, with all these things kind of thought. So I'll just go on until it actually stops. So Schmitt gives one version of liberalism that Leo Strauss proscribes and says is kind of too soft, or it's too much caught in the heavy gravity of liberalism, where he says liberalism begins with the emphasis on deliberation or discussion. The U.S. Senate is supposedly the greatest deliberative body in the world, according to their own propaganda. It puts too much emphasis on discussion. Cortez and all these people, Diogenes Cortez, the jurist, was a distant relative of the conquistador, has talked about this people that just want to talk and talk, and this is sort of associated with liberalism for Schmitt when in 1932 Strauss critiques him, and Strauss says Schmitt just sort of does the opposite and says the opposite of all this talking is combat and death and the sacred fires of war, and von Moltke and peace is just a dream and not even a beautiful dream, as von Moltke put it, and this kind of stuff. And so therefore he's still, I think there's another reason Strauss gives, but this is kind of a clear reason for it, is that therefore he's just like a reactionary or archaic version of, in a strange way, archaic where the more primitive time is being kind of punched out into the future rather than in the past. Version of the liberal. He's still caught in the heavy liberal gravity. And then this, I find that interesting, Das, and then is Trump actually still in the heavy liberal gravity? Partially that's a strange question because we don't know if Trump is like below the limit. Trump is not a thinking person, so even if he has certain, I mean, I guess we could ask the question whether Trump, even though he himself is not a thinking person, could be understood still as a point of somebody who has this light. I suppose so, because he would still have a light, he would still be directing himself. He just doesn't do it in a rationalistic way through forming Stats or Grund or sentences. Interestingly, legal sentences. He makes a lot of them with his his executive orders, which the jurists mostly don't think makes that much sense, but which have some efficaciousness, which have some speech act force behind them. So I think one could ask a lot of questions there, and even though, so I mean, I guess for me that question would have to be, partially I want to settle the question of whether Trump is an anomaly or whether the time being out of joint, as it were, is marks change is great as the change between the militaristic cultures prior to the French Revolution and the talking cultures after it, with the talking cultures which degenerated into entertainment cultures to some extent, but which take their seriousness from the technological essence, the cybernetics, and the AI future.